On March 4th, 1865, Abraham Lincoln was sworn in to begin his second term as President of the United States. This was the first time the country was introduced to Andrew Johnson, and this was not the best way to make a first impression. Andrew Johnson was visibly drunk, and what followed, well, was quite embarrassing. Senator Zachariah Chandler wrote, "The inauguration went off very well, except that the vice president-elect was too drunk to perform his duties and disgraced himself and the Senate by making a drunken, foolish speech. I was never so mortified in my life. Had I been able to find a hole, I would have dropped through it out of sight." In today's episode, we're going to be tackling one of the most complex and contentious periods in American history, the presidency of Andrew Johnson, who assumed the office after the assassination of Abraham Lincoln in April of 1865. Johnson's tenure will be marred by a profound national crisis known as Reconstruction. It is during this period that the country will not only have to rebuild its infrastructure, but it will also have to wrestle with how to reintegrate the southern states into the Union and have to figure out how to deal with millions of newly freed slaves. Johnson's approach to these issues put him on a direct collision course with Congress and culminated in his impeachment, the first in American history. But his impeachment is far from the end of the story. Today we'll look at the political upheavals, Johnson's fierce resistance to civil rights for Black Americans, the rise of radical Reconstruction, and the transformative election of 1868 that will follow Johnson's time in office. Let's get started. It's important to understand the environment that Johnson stepped into after the assassination of Abraham Lincoln in April of 1865. The Civil War had just ended, leaving over 600,000 Americans dead. The Southern economy was in ruins, with its cities destroyed and its infrastructure shattered. Meanwhile, the abolition of slavery, due to the 13th Amendment, left millions of newly freed Black Americans facing an uncertain future. Lincoln had already begun to lay the groundwork for Reconstruction even before the war had ended. His goal was to reunite the nation as quickly and as painlessly as possible. His proclamation of amnesty and Reconstruction, issued in 1863, was a plan designed to encourage Southern states to rejoin the Union by offering lenient terms. States could be readmitted into the Union once 10% of the voters pledged an oath of loyalty to the Union. Lincoln sought reconciliation rather than punishment. He believed the quicker the South could rejoin the Union, the easier it would be to move forward as a nation. But Lincoln's plan was controversial. While moderate Republicans supported Lincoln's approach, radical Republicans like Thaddeus Stevens and Charles Sumner wanted a harsher approach. They demanded that the South be punished for secession and that civil rights for Black Americans be the centerpiece for any Reconstruction effort. The tensions were simmering when Lincoln was assassinated, creating a power vacuum that Andrew Johnson stepped into. Johnson was a self-made man from Tennessee. He came from humble beginnings, growing up in poverty and never receiving a formal education. His rise through the ranks of politics, from tailor's apprentice to governor of Tennessee and then U.S. Senator, was quite remarkable. Despite being a Democrat, Johnson remained loyal to the Union when Tennessee seceded, which earned him a place on Lincoln's ticket in 1864 as a gesture of national unity. Lincoln's hope was that Johnson, a Southern Unionist, would help heal the divided nation. However, Johnson's personal and political beliefs made him ill-suited to lead during Reconstruction. While he opposed secession, he was still a man of the South whose beliefs were rooted in 19th century racial hierarchy. He held firm to the belief that the country should be governed by white men. And while he saw the abolition of slavery as a necessary consequence of war, he had no interest in extending civil or political rights to Black Americans. In his mind, Reconstruction was about reuniting the country as quickly as possible while making minimal changes to Southern society. When Johnson took office, he immediately implemented his plan for Reconstruction, which came to be known as Presidential Reconstruction. His approach was lenient, much more so than Lincoln's. In May of 1865, Johnson issued a proclamation offering amnesty and pardons to former Confederates who took an oath of loyalty to the Union. The only exception were high-ranking Confederate officials and wealthy planters, but even they could apply for special pardons, which Johnson generously granted. Thousands of former Confederates, including top leaders like Alexander Stephens, the former vice president of the Confederacy, regained their rights and positions under Johnson's policies. The Southern states quickly reestablished their governments, often electing former Confederates to positions of power. They also passed a series of laws known as Black Codes. These laws were designed to control the newly freed black population by restricting their rights and keeping them tied to the land as cheap labor. While slavery was technically over, the Black Codes were intended to maintain the pre-war racial hierarchy by any means necessary. African Americans were prohibited from voting, serving on juries, testifying against whites, and even traveling freely in some states. Johnson did nothing to stop this. In fact, he tacitly supported these actions, believing that each state should handle its own racial issues without federal interference. He opposed the idea that the federal government should protect the rights of Black Americans, viewing this as an overreach of power. While Johnson pursued his lenient Reconstruction policies, Congress, especially the radical Republicans, pursued their own vision. The tensions between Johnson and the Congress escalated throughout 1866, beginning with the Freedmen's Bureau Bill. The Freedmen's Bureau, which was established in 1865, sought to transition the newly freed slave to their newfound freedom by providing food, housing, education, and legal assistance. In early 1866, Congress is going to pass a bill to extend the Bureau's powers, but Johnson's going to veto this bill, citing that it's unconstitutional and that it gave too much power to the federal government in state matters. Congress, unable to muster the votes to override the veto, had to concede defeat. But that defeat was temporary. But a more significant piece of legislation was the Civil Rights Act of 1866. The act aimed to protect African Americans from the Black Codes and ensure that all citizens, regardless of race, had equal rights under the law. It was the first federal law to define citizenship and affirm that all citizens are equally protected by the law. Johnson unsurprisingly vetoed it, claiming it would operate in favor of the colored and against the white race. But this time, Congress overrode his veto with a two-thirds majority in both houses of Congress, marking a significant moment in U.S. history. The first time that Congress had overridden a presidential veto on major legislation. This showdown laid the groundwork for one of the most important pieces of Reconstruction legislation, the 14th Amendment. The 14th Amendment, which was passed in 1866 by Congress and ratified by the states in 1868, guaranteed citizenship for those born or naturalized in the United States, including the formerly enslaved people, and it guaranteed equal protection under the law. Johnson vehemently opposed the 14th Amendment, citing that it would lead to, as he called it, a centralized despotism, disrupting the balance of power between the state and federal governments. However, Congress was determined, and this piece of legislation is going to be the cornerstone for civil rights in this country. Johnson's opposition to these measures deepened the rift between him and Congress. His vision of Reconstruction, a quick reintegration of the southern states with minimal changes, was becoming increasingly untenable. By 1867, the situation had reached a boiling point. Congress, fed up with Johnson's obstructionism, took matters into their own hands by passing the Reconstruction Acts. These acts marked the beginning of radical Reconstruction, dramatically changing the course of the post-war South. The first Reconstruction Act divided the South into 5 military districts, each governed by a Union general. These districts were to be occupied by federal troops who were tasked with maintaining law and order. Southern states were required to hold new constitutional conventions where both black and white men could vote, and they were required to ratify the 14th Amendment as a condition for re-entry into the Union. This was a revolutionary moment. For the first time in American history, black men were enfranchised and given a voice in the political process. Radical Republicans in Congress believed that only by completely overhauling Southern society and establishing civil rights for black Americans could the country move forward from its legacy of slavery. Johnson, of course, fought these measures tooth and nail. He declared that these Reconstruction Acts were unconstitutional, and he tried to undermine them at every turn. This set the stage for an inevitable confrontation with Congress, who by this point had taken firm control of the Reconstruction policy. In a desperate attempt to gain support for his policies and challenge the growing influence of the radical Republicans, Johnson is going to embark on a tour in the fall of 1866. This tour, known as the Swing Around the Circle, was intended to rally public support in his favor ahead of the midterm elections. Instead, it turned into a public relations disaster of epic proportions. Johnson's speeches were a mix of rambling monologues, personal attacks, and outright tirades. He railed against Congress, accusing the radical Republicans of seeking to establish a black dictatorship in the South. He even compared himself to Jesus, claiming he was being crucified by Congress. In one particularly infamous incident, he engaged in a shouting match with hecklers, challenging them to a physical fight. The public was appalled by Johnson's behavior, and instead of winning support, he further alienated both moderates and Republicans. The midterm elections were a catastrophe for Johnson. The radical Republicans swept into power, gaining a two-thirds majority in both houses of Congress, allowing them to override any potential veto that Johnson might issue, effectively stripping him of any political power. The breaking point in this conflict between Johnson and Congress came in 1867 with the passage of the Tenure of Office Act. This bill aimed to curtail Johnson's power by preventing him from removing certain office holders, including his own cabinet, without the approval of the Senate. Johnson, seeking to challenge this bill, fired Edwin Stanton, his Secretary of War, and a holdover from the Lincoln administration, who also happened to be a staunch supporter of radical Reconstruction, without seeking Senate approval. Stanton's removal was the final straw. On February 24th, 1868, the House of Representatives will vote to impeach Johnson, making him the first president in American history to face impeachment. Now, the primary accusations brought forth focused on his violation of the Tenure of Office Act. However, the impeachment also reflects broader grievances like his obstruction of Reconstruction policies and his frequent public outbursts against Congress. The trial in the Senate became a national spectacle. For weeks, the nation was gripped by the drama of whether Johnson would be removed from office. The radical Republicans were confident that they had the votes to convict him, but Johnson's lawyers argued that the Tenure of Office Act was unconstitutional and that his actions did not rise to the level of high crimes and misdemeanors. In the end, Johnson was acquitted by just one single vote. 7 Republican senators who feared that his removal would set a dangerous precedent for the country voted against his conviction. And while Johnson remains in office, his presidency is effectively over. He had lost all political capital, and for the remainder of his term, he was largely irrelevant. In terms of foreign policy, after the Civil War, America took a pause on its territorial expansion, focusing instead on rebuilding and healing from the devastation of the conflict. The South turned inward, grappling with Reconstruction, while the nation as a whole shifted its attention to industrial development and westward settlement. Expansion into new territories wasn't a priority, and even if it had been, opportunities seemed limited. Canada had just gained its dominion status from Britain in 1867, solidifying its independence, and Mexico, having overthrown the French-imposed Emperor Maximilian I, emerged with a strengthened national identity. But there was one notable exception: Alaska. This vast, remote territory was offered for sale by Russia, and Secretary of State William Seward seized the opportunity. Seward, a staunch believer in American territorial growth tied to expanding commerce, had been eyeing Alaska for some time. Russia had long struggled to maintain a significant presence in the region, and after losing the Crimean War, the Tsar realized that defending Alaska against British interests was unlikely. By 1867, Russia renewed its offer, and Seward acted quickly, agreeing to purchase the territory for $7.2 million. Though many derided the deal, calling it Seward's folly or Seward's icebox, seeing the land as a frozen wasteland with little value, not everyone was skeptical. One key supporter was Charles Sumner, the chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. Initially hesitant, Sumner undertook a deep dive into the history and resources of Alaska. He spent countless hours studying maps, journals, and over 100 books in multiple languages. The knowledge he gained transformed his view, and when it came time, he delivered a passionate 3-hour speech to the Senate on April 8, 1867, in support of the treaty. His argument helped turn the tide, and the purchase of Alaska was finalized, with the formal transfer of the territory taking place on October 18, 1867. As Andrew Johnson's administration limped to the finish line, the election of 1868 loomed large, shaping up to be a critical test for the nation's future. The Republicans, who were seeking to turn the page from Andrew Johnson's failed administration, pinned their hopes on Ulysses S. Grant, the Union general and war hero whose leadership had made him one of the most revered figures in American history. Grant had deliberately stayed out of the political fray during Johnson's administration, instead focusing on his role as general of the army. And this has led some in the Republican Party to question whether or not Grant is actually the choice here in 1868, primarily because he's never endorsed a Republican candidate. He's never voted Republican. And there are some who are afraid of going down the same path we just saw with Johnson, who wasn't a Republican, was on the ticket with Lincoln, and they don't want another Democrat in office. But in the end, Grant will accept the Republican Party's nomination, marking a significant moment in the party's history. Grant wasn't just a military hero. He was seen as a unifying figure, someone who could bridge the deep divides that plagued the post-war nation and restore a sense of order, stability, and legitimacy to the government. His candidacy symbolized hope for a nation still grappling with the profound challenges of Reconstruction. Meanwhile, Andrew Johnson, despite the overwhelming opposition he faced, had ambitions of winning his own term. He sought the nomination of the Democratic Party, citing that he could recruit and rally the more conservative base of the party. However, the Democrats, sensing that his unpopularity throughout the country made him unelectable, decided to nominate Horatio Seymour, a former governor of New York. Seymour's nomination is important because it highlights the significant fractures within the Democratic Party itself. The party's platform was a mix of conflicting positions. They appealed to the Southern whites who opposed Reconstruction and resented the federal government's efforts to ensure Black Americans' civil rights, and this alienated them from the Northern Democrats who supported the preservation of the Union and the protection of Black Americans' newfound rights. And this prevented the Democratic Party from having a cohesive message in the election of 1868. The 1868 election, in many ways, was a referendum on Reconstruction and the civil rights for African Americans. The Republican Party, under Grant's leadership, firmly supported the continuation of Reconstruction policies, which aimed to rebuild the South while ensuring civil rights for the formerly enslaved population. In contrast, the Democrats under Seymour opposed these measures, framing them as federal overreach and calling for an end to military reconstruction in the South. This stark contrast in platforms made the stakes of the election crystal clear. It was not just a contest between two candidates, but a battle over the direction of the country and the very nature of its democracy. Grant's campaign slogan, "Let us have peace," resonated deeply with a war-weary public eager for closure after years of conflict and political turmoil. The slogan both captured the physical peace needed after the Civil War and the political peace needed to resolve the contentious issues of Reconstruction. When the votes were counted, Grant won a decisive victory in the Electoral College, collecting 214 electoral votes to Seymour's 80. However, the popular vote told a more complicated story. While Grant won around 53% of the popular vote, the race was closer than the Electoral College suggested, highlighting the deep regional and racial divides that still haunted the nation. A critical factor in Grant's victory was the support of newly enfranchised black voters in the South. Under the Reconstruction Acts, many African-American men had gained the right to vote, and they overwhelmingly supported the Republican Party, seeing it as the party of emancipation and civil rights. Their votes played a pivotal role in securing key states for Grant, underscoring the political power of African-American men during Reconstruction. However, this victory for Grant was tempered by the knowledge that in the years to come, Southern states would begin fiercely resisting Reconstruction and begin implementing their own policies to disenfranchise black voters. But for now, Grant's victory was viewed as a hopeful moment in American history, one where equality and unity were at least within arm's reach, even if the road ahead was fraught with challenges. Grant's presidency ushered in a new phase of Reconstruction, one that would continue the policies of radical Republicans and protect the rights of African Americans. But enforcing these policies in the face of Southern resistance would prove immensely difficult. After leaving the White House in 1869, Andrew Johnson will return to his home state of Tennessee, where he will remain active in politics. In a remarkable twist, he will run for the U.S. Senate and win a seat in 1875, becoming the only president in American history to win a Senate seat after his presidency. However, his return to the national political scene will be very short-lived, as he will die from a stroke later that year. Johnson's legacy is one of the most controversial in American history. He is primarily remembered for his opposition to civil rights and his obstruction of Reconstruction. His lenient policies towards the South allowed many of the same elites who had led the Confederacy to regain power, and his refusal to support Black American suffrage delayed the progress of civil rights by decades. However, Johnson's administration also set important precedents. His impeachment trial tested the limits of presidential power and the separation of powers between the executive and legislative branches. His survival by one single vote showed that impeachment was a tool of last resort, not a political weapon to be wielded lightly. That's all the time we have for today. Thanks for joining me. We'll see you next time.